How Hitler's favorite family still controls Germany. Berlin, 1945. The war is over. We tell ourselves a simple story about what happened next. The Nazis lost. Justice was served. The criminals faced trials at Nuremberg. But that story is a lie, because while some men hung from gallows, others walked free. And they didn't just walk away with their lives, they walked away with their empires intact. Germany's richest woman is worth $31 billion today. Her brother holds another $26 billion in his accounts. Together they control BMW, one of the most prestigious automotive brands on the planet. But their fortune wasn't built on engineering brilliance or business innovation. It was built on something far darker. 50,000 enslaved workers labored in their factories during the Third Reich. Torture chambers operated alongside production lines. Gallows stood erected inside the very buildings where car batteries were manufactured. This is not ancient history. This is the foundation of a modern empire. The Quandt family didn't just survive the fall of the Reich, they thrived after it. While other Nazi industrialists faced prosecution, the Quandts faced nothing. They kept their factories. They kept their capital. They kept their political connections. And then they did something remarkable. They rescued BMW from bankruptcy and transformed blood money into a $60 billion dynasty. This is the story of how wealth erases memory, how the ledger always outlives the graveyard, and how one family completely rewrote their darkest chapter while the world looked away. The story begins long before Hitler ever rose to power. Günter Quandt was a textile merchant in the early 20th century, a man with modest ambitions and a small inheritance. Most men would have been content with a comfortable textile business passed down through generations. But Günter Quandt was not most men. He studied the ledger like a monk studies scripture, and he saw something others missed. War makes fortunes. World War I taught Quandt the most valuable lesson of his life. While soldiers died in trenches, his factories hummed with activity. He supplied uniforms to German troops. He manufactured munitions that fed the artillery, batteries on the Western Front. And when the armistice finally came in 1918, Quandt counted his profits. The lesson was clear. Conflict creates demand, and demand creates cash. By the 1920s, Quandt had pivoted his entire business strategy. He moved away from textiles and toward industries that thrived under crisis, chemicals that could be weaponized, batteries that powered military vehicles, metals that could be forged into armaments. Every acquisition was deliberate. Every investment positioned him closer to the machinery of war. He was building an empire designed to profit from catastrophe. He joined the Nazi Party not out of ideological passion, but out of cold calculation. He cultivated relationships with senior Reich officials. He aligned his factories with state priorities, and the regime rewarded him handsomely. By 1937, they gave him a title that revealed everything. Wehrwirtschaftsführer, War Economy Leader. That title meant access to restricted materials. It meant protection from competitors. Quandt stood at the center of the Nazi war machine now, and the cash flowed like a river. His network of companies stretched across Germany. Afid Battery Works, later known as Varda, became a strategic military asset. Submarines ran on his batteries. Armored vehicles depended on them. The entire mechanized war effort relied on Quandt's production capacity. But there was another connection that pulled Quandt even deeper into the Reich's inner circle. His ex-wife Magda had remarried after their divorce. Her new husband was Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister and one of his closest confidants. Hitler himself served as best man at their wedding. Suddenly, Günter Quandt wasn't just a war industrialist. He was family. His son Harold became Goebbels' stepson. The Quandts now had a direct line to the Führer's inner sanctum. By 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, Quandt controlled one of the largest manufacturing empires in Europe. His factories produced batteries, chemicals, weapons, and munitions at industrial scale. The demand was insatiable. The Wehrmacht needed equipment, the Luftwaffe needed supplies, and Quandt delivered it all. But there was a problem: labor. Germany's workforce was stretched to its limit. Millions of men were fighting on the front lines. The factories were desperate for workers. The regime had a solution: forced labor. Concentration camp prisoners were transferred directly to industrial sites across Germany. They were worked until they collapsed. And when they could no longer produce, they were replaced. Günter Quandt and his son Herbert operated at least 3 major facilities that used enslaved workers: Hanover, Berlin, Vienna. It's estimated that 50,000 forced laborers passed through Quandt-controlled factories during the war. Workers faced systematic beatings for failing to meet production quotas. Food rations were deliberately kept below starvation levels. Water was often denied entirely. One survivor later recalled being so desperate for hydration that he drank from the toilets. Another described watching fellow prisoners collapse on the factory floor and being dragged away to die. Death was not an exception. It was the system. The Quandts didn't just use forced labor there. They built a satellite concentration camp directly on the factory grounds. There was no separation between the commercial operation and the camp. No buffer, no pretense. The camp had its own gallows. It had a designated execution area. And all of this existed alongside production lines where batteries were assembled for the Wehrmacht. Let that image settle in your mind. Workers assembling batteries while watching their fellow prisoners hang from scaffolding. This was not hidden in some remote corner of occupied Poland. This was inside a functioning industrial facility in Germany itself, and the profits flowed directly into Quandt family accounts. Every battery produced meant another Reichsmark earned. Every dead worker was simply replaced with another body from the camps. But the Quandts didn't stop at exploiting camp labor. They also participated enthusiastically in Aryanization. That was the Nazi term for the systematic seizure of Jewish-owned businesses. Between 1933 and 1945, hundreds of thousands of Jewish enterprises were confiscated by the state and transferred to loyal party members. The Quandts acquired multiple companies through this process: factories, shops, property, even artwork, all taken without compensation, all laundered through legal mechanisms created by the Reich. By 1945, the war was ending, and the Quandts faced a reckoning, or so it seemed. Allied forces arrested Günter Quandt in 1946 as part of the denazification process. He was interned while prosecutors reviewed his wartime activities. The evidence was overwhelming. His factories used concentration camp labor. He profited directly from Aryanization. He held a senior economic position within the Nazi state. But when the verdict came down, it was astonishingly lenient. The court classified Günter Quandt as a Mittelbürger, a fellow traveler. That legal designation meant he was economically involved with the regime, but played no active leadership role in its crimes. The same man who held the title War Economy Leader was deemed a passive participant. No serious penalties followed. No prison time. No confiscation of assets. By 1948, Quandt walked free. His factories remained under his control. His capital was intact. His empire survived. How did this happen? The answer lies in the economics of post-war Germany. The country was utterly destroyed. Cities were rubble. Infrastructure was shattered. Industrial capacity was crippled. The Allies faced a choice. They could pursue perfect justice and prosecute every Nazi-linked industrialist. Or they could prioritize reconstruction and quietly reintegrate experienced business leaders into the economy. They chose reconstruction. Men like Quandt were simply too valuable to lock away. This decision had generational consequences. While lower-ranking Nazis faced trials and executions, the industrialists who powered the war machine received pardons. The system that enabled their crimes protected them in peacetime, and the Quandts used that protection to rebuild their empire even larger than before. In 1954, Günther Quandt died and passed his fortune to his two sons, Herbert and Harold. They inherited billions in modern currency, and they inherited silence. The 1950s were a pivotal decade for the Quandt family. Post-war Germany was booming, but not every company survived the transition. BMW, the Bavarian Motor Works, was struggling badly. The company had built aircraft engines during the war, but that market was closed to them now. They'd pivoted to motorcycles and small cars, but faced brutal competition. Volkswagen dominated the affordable market. Mercedes-Benz owned the luxury segment. BMW was trapped in the middle, bleeding cash and running out of options. By 1959, BMW was on the brink of collapse. Daimler-Benz began takeover negotiations that would have absorbed BMW entirely. The company would have ceased to exist as an independent brand. That's when Herbert Quandt made his move. He saw potential where others saw failure. He increased his stake in BMW aggressively. He took control of the board, and he forced a complete restructuring of the company's strategy. Quandt pumped capital into BMW when no one else would. He hired new management. He pushed for the development of a new car line that would define BMW's identity for decades. The BMW 1500 launched in 1962 and became the foundation for the company's resurrection. Sales climbed, profits returned, and BMW transformed from a failing motorcycle manufacturer into a global automotive powerhouse. Herbert Quandt became celebrated as a business genius, a savior, a visionary. But here's what the business press didn't discuss. That capital Herbert used to rescue BMW, it came from factories that used slave labor. Those profits he reinvested, they were built on bodies. The Quandt fortune that saved BMW was blood money laundered through corporate restructuring. Yet the narrative focused only on the rescue, on the innovation, on the market success. The dark foundation was never mentioned. By the 1970s, the Quandt family had fully transformed their public image. They were no longer war industrialists. They were philanthropists, investors, patrons of the arts. They sat on the boards of Germany's most respected institutions. They were profiled in business magazines as examples of entrepreneurial excellence, and the past simply disappeared from view. No journalist asked uncomfortable questions. No prosecutor reopened old files. The empire was clean now. This silence lasted for decades. But in 2007, A documentary aired on German television that shattered the carefully constructed mythology. The film exposed the full extent of the Quandt family's use of forced labor during the Third Reich. It included testimony from survivors. It showed archival evidence of the concentration camp at the Hanover factory. It revealed the family's participation in Aryanization, and it asked a simple question: how did they get away with this? The documentary had an impact even inside the family itself. Gabrielle Quandt, daughter of Harold, made a public statement admitting that her family had been wrong to avoid confronting this history. It was a remarkable moment. A member of one of Germany's most powerful dynasties acknowledging complicity. But the acknowledgement came with a gesture. The family pledged $7 million toward memorials for forced laborers. $7 million. From a family worth tens of billions. Let's put that in perspective. $7 million represents roughly 0.01% of the Quandt family's total wealth. Imagine someone worth $1 million donating $100 and calling it restitution for decades of slavery and torture. That's the scale we're talking about. It was a symbolic act designed to close the conversation, and largely it worked. The media covered the donation. The documentary faded from public memory, and the empire continued. Today, the Quandt family remains one of the most powerful dynasties in Europe. Susanne Klatten, Gunther's granddaughter, is worth over $31 billion. Her brother Stefan Quandt holds another $26 billion. Together they control nearly 47% of BMW, but their holdings extend far beyond automobiles. They own stakes in SGL Carbon, which supplies materials to aerospace and defense industries. They control significant shares in Altana, a chemical giant. They held major positions in Varta, the battery company that started it all. These companies shape supply chains across Europe. They influence government policy. They employ hundreds of thousands of workers. And they generate billions in dividends every year. During the COVID-19 pandemic, BMW announced layoffs and wage cuts for factory workers. The company cited uncertainty and financial risk, but at the exact same time, large dividend payments continued flowing to shareholders. The Quandts received hundreds of millions while workers lost their jobs. History was repeating itself. There's a structural reason why the Quandt fortune survived when it should have been dismantled. Wealth in capitalist systems is protected by legal frameworks designed to preserve capital. Even when that capital originates from crimes, the system prioritizes stability over justice. Seizing assets creates uncertainty. It threatens creditors. It disrupts supply chains. So the system finds ways to let the money stay where it is. And the people who control that money get to write the next chapter. The Quandts also benefited from Germany's complex corporate tax structure. In 2007, the same year the documentary aired, the family received a record dividend of 2.37 billion euros from BMW. But instead of being paid directly as income, much of that money was routed through private holding companies. The result was a drastically reduced tax bill. It was entirely legal, but it was also deeply unjust. Ordinary workers paid standard income taxes without loopholes, while Germany's richest family shielded billions. This is how empires survive, not through violence or coercion in the modern era, but through lawyers and accountants. The Quandts employed the best financial advisors in Europe. They structured their holdings to minimize exposure. They diversified across industries and jurisdictions. They made themselves indispensable to the German economy. and that indispensability became their ultimate protection. No government would risk destabilizing a family that controlled so much industrial capacity. Legal claims against the Quandts today are nearly impossible. Most witnesses are dead. Records have been lost or destroyed. The statute of limitations has long since expired, and even if a case could be brought, the family's legal resources are virtually unlimited. Justice grows weaker as history marches forward. The distance between crime and consequence stretches until it breaks entirely, and the people who suffered in those factories received almost nothing. There's a broader lesson here about how history is written. We remember the dramatic moments, the battles, the speeches, the treaties signed in railway cars, but we forget the ledgers, the invoices, the bank transfers, the dividend payments. We forget that empires rise and fall based on cash flow, not ideology. The Quandts understood this. They didn't need to win the war. They just needed to survive it with their capital intact. Sovereignty is solvency. That phrase matters. A nation that runs out of money loses its independence no matter how many tanks it fields. A family that holds capital holds power no matter what crimes funded that capital. The Quandts proved this. They lost the war, but won the peace because their balance sheet survived. And once you have capital in a capitalist system, you can rebuild anything. Reputation, influence, legacy, everything is for sale when you control the cash. Today, the Quandt name appears on museum wings and university endowments. They fund medical research and sponsor art exhibitions. They are respectable, celebrated even. The empire, built on slave labor, now presents itself as a force for progress. And most people accept that narrative without question because the alternative requires confronting an uncomfortable truth. Wealth doesn't care where it came from. It only cares where it's going. And the Quandt fortune is going nowhere but up. The BMW brand itself has become so powerful that it obscures its own history. When people see the blue and white roundel, they think of precision engineering and luxury performance. They don't think of concentration camps. They don't think of forced labor. They don't think of the bodies that powered the factories. The brand has been scrubbed clean through decades of marketing and corporate success, and that cleansing was intentional. But memory is stubborn. It survives in fragments, in survivor testimonies recorded before death, in archival documents hidden in university libraries, in the work of journalists and historians who refuse to let the story die. The 2007 documentary was one fragment. This script is another. Every time the story is told, the sanitized narrative cracks a little. The empire's foundation becomes visible again, and people are forced to ask the question, should this fortune exist at all? There is no satisfying answer to that question. Legally, the Quandts are untouchable. Morally, their wealth is indefensible. Practically, dismantling their empire would be extraordinarily complex, so we're left with an uncomfortable stalemate. The family keeps its billions. The victims are remembered in memorials funded by a fraction of that wealth, and the system that enabled this outcome remains unchanged. Capital protects capital, always. The Quandt story is not unique. Across Europe and America, fortunes built on exploitation have been laundered into respectability. IBM provided the punch card systems that tracked concentration camp prisoners. Hugo Boss manufactured SS uniforms. Volkswagen was founded by the Nazi state itself. All of these companies survived. All of them thrived. and all of them benefit from the same protective mechanisms that shielded the Quandts. This is the architecture of forgetting. Time passes. Executives retire. Corporate structures change hands. And slowly the origin story fades until it disappears entirely. What remains is the brand, the product, the quarterly earnings report. The past becomes inconvenient trivia rather than living memory, and the people who built their fortunes on suffering get to die as philanthropists.